Have you ever gone through something hard and realized the scariest part wasn't just what happened? It was that afterward, you didn't quite feel like yourself anymore. Maybe you still went to work or answered texts or smiled when you were supposed to, but inside, something felt different. Like the version of you before that moment was suddenly more difficult to access. And that's the part of trauma we don't always talk about. We talk about fear, we talk about flashbacks, we talk about nightmares and anxiety and being on edge. But what if trauma also changes something deeper, your sense of who you are?
Welcome to Nerdy Psychology. Break it down with a little curiosity. You'll be curious, stay kind, keep your mind nerdy.
Hi, psychology nerds. Welcome or welcome back. If you're new here, I'm Dr. Angel, a licensed mental health practitioner, and this is Nerdy Psychology, where we break down human behavior in science-based way with practical tools that you can actually use. Around here, we don't just read headlines, we learn how to think about the headlines. Today's topic is a landmark 2025 published paper in World Psychiatry. It's one of the highest impact journals in the field, and it reviews how our understanding of PTSD has evolved since the diagnosis was first introduced in 1980 and where the evidence is pointing to next. Stick around because the biggest takeaway isn't a new symptom or a new statistic, it's a fundamental reframe of what trauma actually disrupts. Since 1980, PTSD has been an official diagnosis, and it's been enormously important. It gave trauma survivors a shared language. It built research infrastructure. It shaped how governments and organizations planned for the psychological aftermath of disasters or war or violence. But a team of 6 leading trauma researchers spanning University College London, a university in Kenya, Washington University, Harvard University, Columbia, they came together to ask a bigger question. After almost 50 years of research, does our current understanding of PTSD still hold up? Their review in World Psychiatry traces the diagnosis from, well, the original criteria through the DSM-5 dissociative subtype, the newer ICD-11 diagnosis of complex PTSD, and evidence that trauma responses shows up in contexts we didn't originally think to call traumatic at all. This isn't a small single lab study. It's a synthesis of 5 decades of evidence from some of the most prominent names in the field, published in a journal with the highest impact factor in psychiatry for 11 years running. When researchers at this level publish something calling for a reconceptualization, it's worth paying attention to. Okay, so let's stay objective before we interpret anything. First, the researchers trace how our definition of trauma itself has expanded. The original criteria conceptualized a traumatic event as something that would overwhelm nearly everyone's coping capacity. Think of combat or assault or disaster. But the evidence has since shown post-traumatic reactions occurring in much broader range of contexts that weren't originally classified as traumatic, which has real implications for who gets diagnosed and who gets left out. Secondly, they document that PTSD isn't one single uniform condition. The DSM-5's addition of a dissociative subtype and the ICD-11's introduction of complex PTSD is a distinct diagnosis, reflecting growing evidence that there are several distinct PTSD phenotypes, different patterns of the same underlying injury, not one universal presentation. Here's a part I most want to spend time on because it's the heart of what you ask about. The researchers describe the psychological foundations of PTSD as involving disturbances to memory, which we've understood for decades, but also just as fundamentally, disturbances to identity. And that's a meaningful shift in framing. For most of PTSD's history as a diagnosis, the clinical focus has centered on fear-based symptoms, things like intrusive memories, hyperarousal, avoidance. This review argues that underneath those symptoms sits something so much deeper: trauma's capacity to disrupt a person's sense of who they are. And the researchers go further, suggesting that a broader focus on identity may help the field better account for group and communal influences on, well, how trauma is experienced, as well as the impact of the resource loss, meaning not just what happened to someone, but what it cost them in terms of roles, relationships, and standing in their community. The research also covers newer, non traditional interventions worth knowing about, including approaches that combine pharmacological and psychological methods, such as MDMA assisted psychotherapy, which has been gathering evidence as a promising avenue alongside more established treatments. As we know, every good study has its limitations, and not because it's bad science, but because that's how science works. And understanding those limitations helps us know how, well, confidently we can apply the findings. There's a few things worth naming here. This is a review and a synthesis. It's not a new primary study. And that's actually a strength in terms of breadth. It draws on decades of research rather than one narrow sample, but it means the paper's conclusions are only as strong as the underlying studies it was built on. And the authors themselves are offering interpretation and direction, not brand new experimental data. The identity framework is still an emergent emphasis, not a settled consensus. The researchers are making an evidence based case for why identity deserves more attention and how we understand PTSD. But this represents a proposed evolution in the field's thinking rather than a already universally adopted diagnostic change. Broadening the definition of traumatic event is genuinely useful, but it also raises open questions the field is still actively working through about where the line gets drawn and how to avoid the definition from becoming so broad it can lose clinical perspective. Findings on newer treatments like MDMA assisted psychotherapy are described as promising, not definitive. Emerging treatments in this space are still working through rigorous trials, regulatory review, and replication before, well, they can be considered standard of care. And none of this means the findings aren't useful. It means we hold this as a rigorous, authoritative synthesis pointing toward where the field is heading. It's not a final closed chapter on what PTSD is. One thing I want to emphasize is that this is not a report card for the researchers. Every good study adds something valuable to our understanding. And the nerdy evidence meter simply helps us think about how confident we can be in applying the findings, well, based on the evidence we have today. For the claim we're discussing today that PTSD fundamentally involves disturbances to identity, not just memory and fear, I'm rating this as strong evidence. And here's why. This is not a single study proposing a novel idea. It's a synthesis authored by some of the most established researchers in the field, published in a high impact journal in psychiatry, and drawn on nearly 50 years of accumulated evidence, including the DSM 5 and the ICD 11's own diagnostic evolutions, which reflects a broad expert and clinical consensus already. When a field's diagnostic manuals themselves have evolved to reflect a concept, as they have here with complex PTSD and dissociative subtype, that's a strong signal of consensus, not just one team's early hypothesis. Science isn't about finding absolute certainty, it's more about becoming more confident as evidence grows. And every study adds another piece to a much larger puzzle. Research tells us, well, what is found in psychology helps us understand what it means and how to use it wisely. Clinically, this reframe matters enormously, and it validates something I hear constantly from people processing trauma. They rarely describe their experience purely in terms of fear. They describe it in terms of who they used to be and who they don't recognize themselves as anymore. I used to be someone who trusted people easily. I used to be the strong one. I don't know who I am since this happened. That's not a side effect of fear based symptoms. According to this research, it may be the core feature of what trauma actually does. And here's where I want to connect some dots across episodes we've done on this channel. This lines up closely with what we've talked about on our episode on losing yourself gradually in a relationship. Except here, Instead of the dimmer switch turning down slowly over years of a small compromise, a single traumatic event can turn the dimmer down all at once. Different mechanism, same outcome. A person left looking at their own life and asking, who am I now? I also want to highlight something the researchers raised that I think gets underappreciated. The point about the group and the communal influences and resource loss. Trauma doesn't just live inside one person's nervous system. It can cost someone their role in their family, their community, their sense of belonging, and any framework that only measures fear responses misses that the entire dimension of what's actually being lost with trauma. So, what does this mean for you? If you experience trauma, big or small, recognized or not, and you've struggled to explain why it feels more than just being scared or being anxious, this research offers real validation. It matters because trauma responses have historically been measured almost entirely through fear based symptoms, which means the identity disruption so many people actually experience hasn't always had a clinical name or been taken as seriously in treatment as it deserves to be. What you should take away if trauma left you feeling like a different, less familiar version of yourself, that's not a strange or unusual side effect. Leading researchers now consider identity disruption a core part of what trauma does. What you shouldn't assume is that this means every difficult experience qualifies as a trauma in clinical sense, that identity disruption looks the same for everyone, or that this research replaces an actual clinical evaluation if you're struggling. This is about understanding the mechanism, not, not, not self-diagnosing. What you can do. Here are 3 practical, evidence-informed takeaways for you today. 1, give the identity piece language, not just the fear piece. If you're processing a difficult experience, try naming both dimensions separately. This made me afraid of X, and this changed how I see myself in Y way. Most people default to only naming the fear, but naming the identity shift too often unlocks a more complete, more accurate picture of what's actually needing healing. 2, ask what the experience cost you beyond the moment itself. This research points to resource loss, roles, relationships, standing as part of trauma's real impact. Ask yourself, what did this experience change about my place in my family, my work, or my community? Not just my internal emotional state. That question often surfaces grief that's been, well, sitting unnamed. 3, seek care that treats identity as part of the picture, not just the symptoms. When looking for support, whether it's therapy or otherwise, it's worth finding a clinician or approach that explicitly makes room for questions like, who am I now? Not just symptom reduction. Both matter, but healing that only targets fear responses may leave the identity work completely undone. This episode is sponsored by my workbook, Your Next Chapter. If today's episode resonated, especially that experience of not quite recognizing yourself after something difficult, the workbook includes guided reflection tools built exactly for this kind of identity work. Understanding who you are now and intentionally building your next chapter rather than just waiting to feel like your old self again. If you're interested, the link is in the description below. Has a difficult experience ever changed how you see yourself beyond just how it made you feel in the moment? What shifted? If this episode helped you think about trauma a little differently, I would love it if you would like the video and subscribe if you're not already a part of the nerdy psychology community, and share it with someone who's ever said, I don't feel like myself since that happened. PTSD has always been understood through the lens of fear, but leading trauma researchers now argue it's just as fundamentally about identity, about who someone believes they are after what happens to them. As always, the research is linked in the description below if you're interested in reading it. If today's conversation connected with you, I think you'll really enjoy my episode on when did I stop feeling like me? Because it explores the flip side of what we talked about today. Not one sudden disruption to identity, but the slow, quiet accumulation of small compromises that can reshape who someone believes they are, one dimmer switch notch at a time. And as always, stay curious, be kind, and keep your mind nerdy. See you Tuesday. That's a wrap.
Be curious, stay kind.